This is the philosophy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. But in this lecture, I'll be focusing on his metaphysics. We focus on metaphysics. First, let's discuss the general character of Leibniz philosophy. We have already mentioned that he belonged to the rationalist tradition. So he follows the philosophy of René Descartes. But of course, Leibniz developed his own philosophy following the rationalist tradition. So here we can see that Leibniz's philosophy combines the mathematical and physical discoveries of his time with the organic and religious conceptions of nature found in ancient and medieval thought. So even if we say that the modern philosophers are quite critical of medieval philosophy, we can still see that some of them actually integrated into their philosophy some of the concepts that were expressed by the medieval philosophers. So, of course, there is the religious conception of reality. There is the notion of God. And of course, God is understood as the creator and the one who sustains what he created. But at the same time, we know that during the Renaissance, during this time, there were plenty of physical discoveries. So, and of course, one of the methods that was developed during that time is the method of mathematics. So, it's quite common among the philosophers of the time to combine the method of mathematics and the discovery of the sciences together with what they already know from the ancient and from the medieval era about the nature of reality. So somehow, Leibniz philosophy belongs to that, it belongs to that uh, kind of mentality or that kind of mental framework. So he combines the modern mathematics and Aristotelian in scholastic philosophy. And this combination is, of course, manifested in his view of the world. So, two important uh, influences in the philosophy of Leibniz. You have, of course, mathematics, science, and scholastic philosophy. Now, the task of Leibniz was to search for universal cosmic harmony and unity through the principles of mathematics and theology. A universal cosmic harmony. This idea of universal cosmic harmony is very central in the philosophy of Leibniz, as we will see later on. He hopes to reconcile science and religion, mechanism and teleology, modern and ancient or scholastic philosophy. So again, uh, the old meaning the belief, the prior belief would be the belief in religion, in teleology, based on scholastic philosophy. But now there are many discoveries in the sciences, the mechanistic view of the world. So Leibniz hopes to reconcile all these somehow different, sometimes contrasting views about reality. So Leibniz's view that all things are organic and spiritual initiated the philosophical tradition of idealism. So there is the organic aspect of reality, and there is the spiritual aspect of reality. He viewed the world as an infinite number of infinitely small units of force, which he would call monads. And each of these monads has its own system of perception. Okay? So the monads are closed, meaning they are independent from one another, pretty much like the atoms. The atoms as it is conceived in the ancient time, not the atom as it is now understood, because we can now split the atom today. But these monads, they all mirrors the other monads in its own system of perception. Now, the monads would be a later development in the philosophy of Leibniz. So first, let's go to the nature and notion of God. Like many of his contemporaries, Leibniz owed a number of his assumptions about God as the creator of the world to ancient tradition, especially Neoplatonism. We have already discussed uh, during our topic on medieval philosophy. We have touched on the idea of emanation and creation based on the philosophy of Neoplatonists, which actually influenced also the philosophy of Saint Augustine. So Plotinus theorized that from one emanates the nous, meaning the intelligible world, and then the nous emanates the soul, and from the soul emanates the world. So this is the notion of emanation, the bringing uh, to existence of something out of the perfection of higher being. So the one is a higher being, and then from it emanates the nous, and then from the nous emanates the lower being of the soul, and then the world. So Leibniz explained the activity of God through this notion of emanation. He said, there is an ultimately good, perfectly self-sufficient, and thoroughly unified supreme being on which everything else depends, and which itself depends on nothing. And this being is God. So God is ultimately good. He is self-sufficient, and everything depends on God, and God does not depend on anything for its existence. Now, God's mind contains a number of ideas or attributes. Now, so this is now similar to the nous of Plotinus. So these ideas or attributes are in the mind of God. So ideas like justice, okay, and the other uh, concepts, which are the perfect essences of things and which are used as models for created things. So when you talk of these ideas in God as the models of created things, they act like exemplars, the models, the prototype of the things that God created in the world. So if we have justice here is a kind of manifestation of the idea of perfect justice in the mind of God. So the idea of justice in the mind of God becomes the model of justice that we find here. So all these models are already in the mind of God. Okay? Saint Augustine would call that the exemplary ideas. So the idea or attribute of God is emanated to a creature, meaning it is manifested in the creature in such a way that God nor his attribute is not depleted in any way, while the creature acquires the attribute, though in an inferior manner. So for example, let us talk of the attribute of beauty. So the attribute of beauty is in the mind of God. It is an attribute of God. Okay? Now, when God creates something and this something is beautiful, so the beauty is emanated, is manifested in the creature, but the beauty of God is never depleted. So the creature acquires beauty, but the beauty in God does not diminish. And the beauty that we find in the creature is of an inferior type, meaning it is inferior, of course, compared to the beauty that we find in God. So the imitative process is a continual process. so that a creature instantiates a divine attribute, manifests a divine attribute, if and only if God emanates the attribute to the creature. If God gives, shares this attribute with the creature. So it's a continual process of emanation. So there are many terms that we use to describe this emanating process. It could be that the creature participates in the attribute of God, or that the creature instantiates or manifests these attributes of God. So, in the discourse of metaphysics, Leibniz writes, it is evident that created substances depend upon God, who preserves them and who even produces them continually by a kind of emanation. Okay? Kind of emanation, a kind of, say, the outpouring of an attribute or goodness or perfection, the sharing of this perfection or attribute. Now, the next idea is the notion of plenitude and sympathy. The divine essence, as we have said, is emanated in the created substances, not just its creature, but to the whole of creation. So meaning God emanates his perfection, his divine essence, not only in one particular creature or in individual creatures. It is emanated actually in the whole of creation, his whole creation. So the principle of plenitude, meaning by plenitude, meaning the whole, okay? The whole of creation. It develops from the idea that the more of the divine essence in the world, the more there is divine essence in the world, and hence of being and goodness, the better. The more that there is a manifestation of the goodness and being of God in the world, the better for us, or the better for everybody, or the better for reality. So that's the basis of the principle of plenitude. So plenitude suggests that there will be as much diverse being as possible. And by that, meaning the more being, the better the world. But this diversity of being also be properly unified, meaning the more unity, the better the world. So the plenitude will tell us that there is a diversity of being in the world. But although there is a diversity of being in the world, or in the created world, these diverse beings are also unified. So the more being, the better the world. The more unity, the better the world. One of the results of this unity among the parts of the world is cosmic sympathy. Cosmic sympathy. Later on, he will call that harmony. Because diverse the created beings are, there are different kinds of beings, but there is a unity among them because they emanated from one and the same source. So cosmic sympathy means that each part of the world is in sympathy, okay, with all the others. It is in harmony with all the others. So they may be different beings, but there is a unity of this diversity of being. And this unity of diversity brings about cosmic sympathy. So the principle of plenitude implies that God fills creation with as much being as possible and unifies these diverse beings as much as possible. Unity in diversity. Now, such a diverse and unified world is supposed to engender wonder, delight, and awe on the part of human beings. So when we look at the world, at what God created, we may see the diversity of beings all around us. But at the same time, there is a kind of harmony, a kind of unity, kind of sympathy among all these diverse beings. And according to Leibniz, that engenders, that causes wonder, delight on our part. We become delightful. We are in awe for the grandeur of God's creation. So, the assumptions about emanation, about plenitude, and sympathy would become the basis of many of Leibniz's philosophical theories or accounts. There is the theory of universal harmony, which he will develop later on, later in his career. There is, of course, his views about the mind as a mirror. There is his account of knowledge, his epistemology, his solution to the problem of evil, and his views about the mirroring and expressing of substances. So this would be some of the basic, some of the most important philosophical theories of Leibniz that he would later develop in his career. But all of these are based on the assumption about emanation, plenitude, and sympathy. Now, let's go to another very important concept of Leibniz, universal harmony. So we have already seen that the reality, the world that God created is diverse in being, but at the same time, it is unified. It is a unity. Universal harmony is diversity compensated by identity. And Leibniz formulates this doctrine in terms of hypothesis. He said, God does not or does nothing that is not properly, not orderly. Okay? God does nothing that is not orderly. So, one can say that no matter how God and the created world, it would have been regular and in some general order. No matter what, how God made this world, there will always be a kind of order. Now, God has chosen the most perfect world. That is, the one which is at the same time the simplest in hypothesis and the richest in phenomena. Meaning, it's rich in phenomena because there are so many diverse beings. But at the same time, it is simplest because God unifies everything. So, the single, unified, and perfect Supreme Being freely chooses and emanates the divine attributes through creatures. God remains transcendent while all creatures become an imperfect instantiation or emanation or manifestation of God's attributes. So even if God instantiated, emanated, shared, okay, manifested his perfection to his creatures, God remains perfect and he remains transcendent. Because God emanates the divine essence to all its products, God therefore is both the reason, the ratio of the world, and the unum, or the principle of unity, okay, of the world. So both ratio and unum. Now, this universal harmony entails that God relates to the world and to its creature in it in two ways. So the idea of Leibniz of a God is not an absentee God who created the world and then later on left the world. God continues to relate with the world. And he relates that in two ways. First, God is the multiplicity in the world, insofar as the divine essence is variously manifested in the vast diversity of creatures and in the diversity of the perceptions of its creature. And second, that God is also unity, the principle of unity, insofar as its created thing is a unified instantiation of the divine essence, and therefore related to and reflective of all the others. So you see here that Leibniz is trying to portray God as the very principle, the very source of the multiplicity or of the diversity of the beings or creatures he finds in the world, but at the same time, he is the principle of the unity of these diverse beings that he created. So, the world is full of various perceptions of the world or phenomena, meaning the different objects that you find in the world are different perceptions. By perceptions, meaning different mirrorings, different reflections. Okay? So, the different objects, beings that you find in the world are manifestations. Uh, they are the reflections of God's essence. So it contains an infinity, the world contains an infinity of different expressions of the divine essence. So everything that we see here in the world are expressions or manifestations or perceptions, okay, of the divine essence. So take note of how the term perception should be understood here. So this notion of universal harmony forms the basis for Leibniz's mature theory of pre-established harmony. Okay? So he will develop these ideas later on in his career. And of course, the notion of pre-established harmony is one of the central concepts in the metaphysics of Leibniz. Now, let's discuss the notion of the mind as a mirror, because when you talk of mirror, then of course the nature of the mirror is to reflect, right? To reflect something. And he will describe the mind as a kind of a mirror. It reflects the perfection, the attributes, okay, of God or the divine essence. Now, for Leibniz, Locke failed to recognize that the principles of necessary truth are already latent in our mind. We should remember that for Locke, he described the mind as a kind of tabula rasa. It's a blank slate, empty. And our sense experience will write something on our mind. But according to Leibniz, there's something that Locke failed to understand or to recognize. And that is the fact that the mind is a spiritual substance. It's not really a physical substance where nothing is there. The mind is a spiritual substance, and as a spiritual substance, there are already some truths that are in the mind. Okay, so the mind as a spiritual substance is not really empty. There is already the principles of the necessary truth that are already embedded in the mind. So, for Leibniz, there is a metaphysical dimension to a proper appreciation of our mind's dignity. And it involves recognition that the mind is an immaterial or spiritual substance, and that it is as causally self-sufficient as is consistent with its status as a creature. So the mind is not just a kind of a physical entity, it's actually an immaterial substance. And as such, it is self-sufficient. Okay, it is self-sufficient. Now, this is, of course, one of the main concepts of Descartes about the mind as a cogito. So, he first developed the idea of mind as a mirror in the elements of natural law, okay, one of his earlier writings. And for him, every mind is like a mirror. And we've already mentioned that function of the mirror, then it's the nature of the mirror to reflect, okay, to reflect something. So there will be one mirror in our mind and another mirror in other minds. So our minds are like mirrors reflecting the divine essence. Thus, if there are many mirrors, meaning there are many minds, many minds recognizing our goods, then there will be a greater light. And when you combine all these lights of the mind, the gathered splendor will produce kind of a glorious, kind of a, a kind of a wonderful, awe-inspiring event or phenomenon. And that is exactly how the world is according to Leibniz. So through this notion, Leibniz goes beyond the idea of plenitude and sympathy of Neoplatonism. He assumed that the sympathetic relations among these minds and heightened their connections by making its substance, its mind, a mirror of all the others, because its mind is unconsciously aware of all the others. So the mind, the mind as a mirror, okay, reflects the other minds. It manifests also the other minds. Its mind eternally mirrors the entirety of the world, and it does so from its own perspectives. So my mind, for example, it mirrors reality. I have my own ideas of reality. So my own ideas, if I consider my own mind having these ideas of reality, so my ideas of this reality mirrors, it reflects the world. Okay, so for example, I have my own perspective about reality. So my perspective of a particular reality of the world mirrors the world. But of course, when my mind mirrors the world, when it reflects the world, Leibniz not saying that that is a perfect mirroring. That is a perfect, that is a perfect reflection of everything. No, it's just that I mirror, I reflect the goodness, this particular aspect of reality. Okay, and I have my own perspective. I have my own vantage point about how I mirror, how I reflect a particular reality. Okay? So, no two substances or minds mirror the world from the same perspective. Let's consider our individual minds. I will have my own perspective. You will have your own perspective. Other people will have their own perspective. So imagine the mirror. If you uh, hold the mirror this direction, that in reflects one particular aspect of reality, this mirror reflects a different aspect of reality. And no two minds would have the same perspective. Okay? So, in the same way that travelers approaching a town from different directions see the town from different perspective, so each mind approaches the world from a different perspective. So we mirror the world from different perspectives. So for Leibniz, each mind has a unique view of the world. For in this way, a wonderful variety arises. So Leibniz, instead of focusing on the different perceptions, we can say maybe different perspectives of its mind, he focused on the variety, on the beauty of this collection of unique perspectives. So he recognizes the uniqueness of its perspective, but at the same time, he also recognizes that despite this diversity, there is a harmony, okay, that is natural, that is inherent in all these perspectives. So here in monadology, this is a quotation from the monadology. Just as the same city viewed from different directions appears entirely different and as it were multiplied prospectively, in just the same way it happens that because of the infinite multitude of simple substances, meaning multitude of minds, There are, as it were, just as many different universes, because each mind is a kind of reflection of the universe. So many universes, which are nevertheless only perspectives on a single one, corresponding to the different points of view of each monad, meaning of each mind, the mind as a monad. And this is the way of obtaining as much variety as possible, but with the greatest order possible, meaning the greatest unity possible, or harmony. That is, it is the way of obtaining as much perfection as possible. So this is now the methodology, which is the later, the matured work of Leibniz. But you can see here that these things that he's talking in the methodology, they actually find their earlier expressions in his earlier writings, his earlier concepts. So Leibniz claims that each substance expresses God, each substance expresses the world, and each substance expresses every other substance. That's the meaning of reflecting, mirroring. Each substance mirrors God, each substance mirrors the world, each substance mirrors the other substances. So each substance is an emanation of God's essence, and in this sense, each shares the same essence. Now, share does not mean that our substance is equal or identical with God's substance. No, we participate, we partake in the same essence, but it does not mean that our essence is the same as God's. Okay? So he compares the essence of God to a number that can be expressed in an infinity of ways. So this is just an analogy, each of which is more or less a clear expression of the essence. So let's look at these different expressions. This is, of course, a kind of analogy. So for the number 6, whether the expression is 3 plus 3, or 2 times 3, or 4 plus 2, each is an expression of the same thing. Although, no one can doubt that the one expression differs from the other. But they express one and the same thing, then that is the concept of 6. In the methodology, Leibniz would describe the human mind as the images of divinity itself. And he distinguishes between the perfection of God and the limitation of creatures. So again, although we share in the divine essence, we don't have the same degree of perfection as that of God. So there's a distinction between the perfection of God and our limitation as creatures of God. So he would insist in methodology that what is limited in us, in him, it is without limit. Meaning, as creatures we are finite, but God is infinite. So he argues that God alone is the primitive unity, or the first simple substance. And all the created or derivative monads are products and are generated, so to speak, by a continual emanation. An emanation of the divinity from moment to moment, limited by the receptivity of the creatures. Now, let's connect now universal harmony and knowledge. So, we understand the notion of universal harmony. Now, how do we know? How do we connect this to our knowledge? So again, we have said that the divine ideas are instantiated, manifested, reflected in the creatures in the world, and exist in the human minds innately. Okay? So here he writes, again, this is from the Discourse on Metaphysics, the essence of our soul is a certain expression, imitation, or image of the divine essence, and of all the ideas comprised in it. Okay? So, imitation, image, expression, reflection, mirroring, instantiation, emanation, etc., etc. We hear a lot of terms, but they mean one and the same thing. The goal of human life now is to recognize the beauty and harmony in things. And harmony consists in consonance beneath apparent dissonance. So we must learn to see beyond the dissonance. What is this consonance and dissonance? The dissonance would be the differences, the diversity, the multiplicity. So when we look at reality, we see the dissonance, the diversity, the multiplicity. But at the same time, there is a consonance, a kind of harmony, a kind of, a kind of unity, a sympathy. So our goal in life is to recognize that despite the diversity, the multiplicity, the dissonance, there is an underlying harmony, an underlying sympathy, an underlying consonance, okay, beneath this dissonance. So once we abstract from the confusion of things and begin to recognize the underlying order of the world, the journey to this ultimate knowledge has begun. So there may be some negativities, there may be some evil in the world, there may be some bad things in the world, but underlying this is a kind of unity, kind of harmony beneath all these, we can say imperfection of the world. Now, so we need to understand that. We need to understand the consonance underlying the dissonance in reality. And the first object of our knowledge are our innate ideas, meaning the latent principles in our mind, each of which is also an idea in God's mind, and so also instantiated in the world. Okay? So by grasping one of these ideas in the right way, meaning our own ideas, we begin the process of knowing God and the ultimate nature of things. So, as we've said, the goal of life is to recognize that everything is an emanation of God and therefore a proper object of love. God, that we need to understand, okay, that God created everything or emanated everything, and everything that God created is good. And therefore, everything that He created is a proper object of love. Again, he wrote in one of his earlier works, the nature of mind is to think. Therefore, the harmony of the mind will consist in thinking about harmony. And the greatest harmony of the mind, or happiness, will consist in the concentration of universal harmony, that is, of God in the mind. So our object of contemplation must be God Himself. The goal of life is to intuit the essence of God, which is evident in the universal harmony of the world. The means to this goal is to grasp the eternal and immutable ideas, meaning to understand. So we have our individual ideas, but our goal is to understand, to grasp, to understand the eternal and immutable ideas, okay, of God. But how, of course, how do we grasp the eternal and immutable ideas? That's the question. Now, according to Leibniz, the journey to knowledge, this grasp of the eternal and immutable ideas, begins when we withdraw from the senses and draws back into our own mind. So you see here now the rationalistic, the rationalistic attitude of Leibniz, that we need, if we want to understand the essence of God, if we want to appreciate the universal harmony in the world, if we want to grasp the eternal and immutable ideas, first thing that we should do is to withdraw from the senses and go back to our own mind. Universal harmony increases possibility for knowledge, and the mirroring of the minds increases it all the more. Because there are many minds, right? My own mind is a reflection, a manifestation of certain aspect of reality. So the fact that I am discussing Spinoza or Leibniz right now about philosophy, my mind mirrors a particular aspect of reality from my own perspective. So our understanding of universal harmony is increased by the mirroring of minds. So for Leibniz, the wisdom of God requires that creatures mirror one another and thereby add to the beauty and harmony of the world. So I teach, my own way of teaching is a kind of mirroring. Your own study, your own readings, and the papers that you will write or publish are also mirroring of the world from your own perspective. So for Leibniz, our knowledge of God would require that each one of us mirror one another. And when this happens, it actually adds beauty and harmony to the world. The mirroring of minds increases variety and harmony because each mind encompasses the whole of existence. Now, when you say each mind encompasses the whole of existence, it does not mean that one particular mind has a perfect, a perfect mirroring or perfect reflection of everything. No. It's just that this particular mind reflects reality from its own perspective. So somehow, to some extent, it encompasses the whole of existence, but it's not a kind of a perfect, the absolute reflection of everything. No, because every mind does so from its own perspective. Now, how do we now explain the problem of evil, given that everything seems to be working according to God's plan? How can the evil in the world, say the suffering of innocence, be reconciled with the existence of an infinitely powerful, just, and good Supreme Being who seems to have who have created everything, to be good? There are many beings that he created are diverse, but at the same time there is a harmony among them. So how do we account for evil? For Leibniz, the goodness of God is sufficient reason to create a world that is the best possible. The best possible world. And that evil, or apparent evil, is a necessary part of that world. Apparent evil is a necessary part of that world. So his explanation or solution is embedded again in his notion of universal harmony. The world is the best and most harmonious possible, despite the fact that its enormous diversity would include events that often suggest otherwise. Because it's always quite natural to think that because there is so much diversity in the world, then it's possible that there are things that are in this world that are not in harmony with other things, like the suffering of people, calamity, okay, violence, war, hunger, etc. So, the divine intellect contains an specified number of eternal and immutable ideas that constitute the divine essence, in that God wills to instantiate in the world. Meaning, so imagine, of course, we cannot fully understand, comprehend the divine mind, but imagine the divine mind, the divine intellect. That would be unspecified, meaning an infinite number of ideas, eternal, immutable ideas, that God can instantiate in the world. So, the essence of God contains the nature of the things in themselves. So, everything that He created have their own models, have their own exemplars in the divine ideas. Okay? So, whatever God created, whatever God instantiates in the world, are contained in that immutable ideas, okay, in His divine intellect. But the essence of God does not necessitate this nature of things. Okay? Does not necessitate this nature of things. Meaning that God selects among possible versions of the divine essence and then emanates the selected version so as to create and sustain the world. So think of a particular perfection, and in the mind of God, there may be different possible versions of this perfection. So think of a good kind of perfect, a goodness, or think of the idea of beautiful. And there may be infinite versions of what a beautiful world would be in the mind of God. And from these different possible versions of goodness or possible version of the world, God chose this particular version. So He selected this particular version and then created this version and sustained it in the world. There are many other possibilities. There are many other possible worlds, but God decided, okay, this is the best possible version. So I'm going to create it, and then I'm going to sustain it. So each individual created thing is an instantiation of the selected divine essence. And for Leibniz, God has a sufficient reason for choosing its thing. And its thing has a sufficient reason for acting as it does. So if God created this world, or created this thing, this version of the divine idea, or of the divine essence, then it shows that for God, this is the best possible version. So here, Leibniz summarizes his position. The present state of things depends on a series of things, and that the series of things depends on the universal harmony. The universal harmony depends on those well-known eternal and immutable ideas themselves contained in the divine mind. God is the sufficient and complete reason for the world. And God understands this world to be the most harmonious, the best version, and thereby has sufficient reason to choose it. So if God decided to choose this version, He has a sufficient and complete reason to create this particular world. This is the best possible world. This is the best version. This is the problem, however, because this concept of the best possible world solution to the problem of evil gives rise to further problems. And one of these is sin. Who is the author of sin? And how do we account human freedom in the best possible world scenario? So it would seem that God causes evil because God creates the best series of things. And in this best series of things, evil seems to be a part of it. So there are many things that we can include here. Things that we can consider to be themselves bad and sinful. So there are many things that we can consider as that is bad, this is evil, this is sinful. But it is part of the series. It is part of the best possible version of the world that God created. In one of his works, he's actually entitled The Philosopher's Confession, Leibniz responds to this problem by pointing out that God takes no delight in the existence of evil. And therefore, it's not properly thought to will it. God did not will it. Okay? God did not will for something evil to happen. But according to Leibniz, there must be sufficient reason for everything that happens in the world, including those things that we consider to be evil. We consider to be evil. Now, so, problem is that when apply to the problem of human freedom, the principle commits him to a kind of determinism, because that would mean that, well, God already determined what will be our course of action. Now, according to Leibniz, the will never be free of antecedent causes. And in that sense, it is always determined. But just as God's perfect freedom does not involve a lack of determination by the divine essence, so human freedom does not require undetermined choices. Okay? So freedom for Leibniz requires only spontaneity, the source of spontaneity possessed by rational substances. In other words, Leibniz does not deny that there will be antecedent causes to our action. But in the very moment that we are making a decision, we are free. Our choice would be spontaneous. Why spontaneous? Well, because we don't know what is in the future. Okay? So there may be some things that determine our situation now, but how are we going to proceed based on the situation for Leibniz is undetermined. It is spontaneous. Okay? So for Leibniz, there is still human freedom because we act spontaneously. There may be some antecedent causes, but when we make a decision, our decisions are spontaneous. And for Leibniz, that's the requirement of freedom. Now, let's focus more on God's existence in the best of all possible worlds. So, God exists, and Leibniz proves this notion of God's existence based on arguments that we have already discussed, like, for example, the arguments of Descartes, the arguments of Anselm and St. Augustine. The best of all possible worlds, okay, is again related always to the nature of God. Leibniz, as we have said, asserts that the world, taken as a whole, the sum of its world history, from beginning to the end, or what will ever be its end, is a better story. It is a better story than any other version of the story. So this world is the best version of all the possible worlds and God could have created based on his divine ideas. Before creation, according to Leibniz, God may be like a good script writer or programmer who chose from all possible plots and characters, designs, and programs. Okay? So if you are a storyteller, a script writer, you have already in your mind the different, twists and turns, the plot, the characters, the design, everything. Okay? And there could be an infinite possibility of all these, plots and twists and turns and characters, infinite possibilities. But God, the script writer, God the programmer, God the author, chose this one to create. And therefore, this is the best possible version. So again, his argument for this is this: God is a moral, perfect, all-knowing, and powerful being. And a moral, perfect, all-knowing, and powerful being always chooses the best possible alternatives. Since God chose to create this world, therefore this is the best of all possible world. Why is there evil in the best possible world? He said, metaphysical evil is unavoidable perfection because, of course, there will always be a privation of perfection, which is present in any finite and created beings. As for physical evil, he claimed that there is more physical good than physical evil in the world. And in fact, those physical evil, those things that we can consider to be physical evil, they have their own reasons or purpose. Moral evil is caused by the free choice of people may lack a rightly ordered will. So God is not the cause of moral evil. If there are things that we consider to be physical evil, if we consider the whole scheme of things, there will be more physical good than physical evil in the world. Okay. Could God have created a world without physical evil or without sin? Maybe, but God did not see it as the best possible version. So for him, a little amount of physical evil is still a better version of the world. Nature of substances, this is the last topic here. For most of his life, Leibniz takes there to be two kinds of basic natural entities or substances. Following Descartes, of course, the res cogitans and the res extensa. So the first sort of these corporeal substances constituted the two principles of nature, one active, one passive. So before, he used to follow the idea of Descartes, but later on, he abandoned this idea of Descartes. He was trying to come up with his own idea of substances. Okay? So later on, he would say that there are many substances, and the monads are these substances composed of, the world composed of an infinite number of monads. So when you talk of corporeal substances, they're analogous to like organisms. They're active, unified things with a material component or body and an organizing principle. We can see here the influence on Leibniz of the ancient and scholastic notion of the two substances. So this is different now from the res cogitans and the res extensa of uh, Descartes. The second kind of substance is variously called mind or soul or spiritual substance or substantial forms. The substantial forms, although are the active things in nature and are tied to material component of some sort, are themselves also substances. So you have the, if you, it will be very important, it will be very helpful to understand this following the nature of substances of Aristotle and Aquinas, because this is very similar to that idea. Okay, so you have the corporeal substances. They are composed of body and form. Okay, in the case of other substances, there is the material and the substantial forms, and the substantial forms are also substances themselves. Now, in his last work, meaning in the monadology, he would call these ultimate components of nature as monads. So in the world of his monadology, there are only mind-like simple substances in various collections. So, for most Aristotelian philosophers, natural objects are constituted of two principles. We have already discussed this, matter and form. And natural events are explained in terms of the actualization of potency of these two principles. Okay? So, according to the mechanical philosophy, okay, philosophy of nature, it is composed of matter. So, things are composed of matter, whether the extended resistance of the car or the atoms of the sandy. So, all physical substances or physical phenomena are to be explained in terms of some kind of matter and motion. And although these thinkers disagreed about how to define the material component of nature, they all took it to be void of substantial forms. So matter is void of substantial form. So matter is static. Matter is passive. Okay. Now, Leibniz's most fundamental assumption about the natural world is that it is composed of substances, and each of these substances is constituted as a self-sufficient, unified thing. The material stuff of the mechanical philosophers, meaning of the scientists, mechanical scientists, did not have its own internal source of activity, and therefore they are neither self-sufficient nor properly unified. Therefore, this material, this substance, according to the mechanical philosophers, could not by themselves constitute genuine substances because they are passive, they are static, they are not self-sufficient, they don't have a principle of unity. So, in his earliest comments about substances, Leibniz explains that because the corporeal substances of the mechanical philosophers or scientists is not self-sufficient, they are incorporeal principle, and incorporeal principle must be added. So, the corporeal substances is passive, it is not self-sufficient, therefore, there must be an immaterial principle that must be added to this. And for Leibniz, this incorporeal or immaterial principle is the substantial form, or a mind that organizes the matter and thereby making matter into a unified self-sufficient being. So for Leibniz, there must be a material substance or material principle and an immaterial principle. This immaterial principle is the substantial form. Now, next point, pre-established harmony and phenomenalism. Before he used the word or the term pre-established harmony, Leibniz actually calls it the theory of concomitance. Okay? So the doctrine of pre-established harmony holds that each substance acts out of its own nature, spontaneity, and that no substance causally interact with any other substance. This is the notion of wall apartness. That they don't communicate. There's no cause and effect relation between the substances. And yet, each substance in the world parallels the activities of all the other substances perfectly. Now, this is the notion of parallelism. Okay? So there's no causality, there's no interaction between or among the substances, but they act as if there is a coordination, there is a harmony between or among them. So, the theory is closely related to phenomenalism, and it includes two claims. First, that bodies are phenomenal objects, and so our perceptions of them arise from our own internal nature. And second, that our perceptions, nevertheless, corresponds to or parallel to the activities of the real, meaning the unextended and mind-like substances. So it's like there is the body in our perception, and there is a kind of a harmony between these two bodies. So pre-established harmony could be seen as a result of the combination of universal harmony. Remember that there is a unity, a harmony among the diverse objects. Okay? The self-sufficiency of substances, that, remember, the substantial form that makes every substance sufficient, self-sufficient, active, and the mirroring of substances. Okay? That we mirror, each substance mirrors or reflects the other substances. So in order for us to understand this pre-established harmony, we have to understand the meaning of universal harmony, the meaning of the substantial form as the cause of the self-sufficiency of substances, and the idea of the mirroring of substances. So according to universal harmony, God emanates his divine essence to every creature. The unity of the world is due to the fact that all creatures express the same thing. Its multiplicity to the fact that each creature expresses the divine essence in a different way from its different perspectives. Now, the substantial nature, the substantial form, assumption may be taken to entail that the complete reason for all the features of a substance is combined in its nature. In which case, the complete reason for its perceptual state is contained therein as well. So, the conjunction of the substantial nature assumption and the universal harmony suggests spontaneity. Okay? There is a kind of, a kind of natural, a natural, some kind of a symphony, some kind of a harmony, okay, or a kind of he already used sympathy. So for each substance, the manner of its expression of the divine essence will be contained in its nature, meaning every substance has in its nature an expression of the divine essence, And therefore, there is already a kind of pre-established sympathy or harmony among substances. Further, if we assume that the substantial nature of the substance contains the necessary and sufficient conditions for each and every feature in it, then it follows that the cause of every feature of the substance is contained in its nature, which is consistent with the world apartness, meaning that although they are separate, okay, but they can be harmonized, and the idea that there is no causal interaction among substances. So there is no causal interaction among substances, but each substance already contains in its nature the harmony. Okay, harmony. So for example, let's take an example here. If you're familiar, for example, with the keys of the guitar or of the keys of the piano, one key does not affect how the other key will sound or the pitch, right? So each key is independent, it's apart, but in each key already contained in itself the harmony, its harmony with the other keys. So that when you combine the different keys, even if they don't causally interact with one another, they produce harmony. Because the harmony is already contained in each of the key. That's the pre-established harmony of the keys of the piano. In the world, as God created it, can be explained that way also. So the theory of its substance mirrors all the others, resembles the tenet of parallelism. So that's the so here, just to finally close this discussion, the parallelism of phenomenalism and pre-established harmony are related to the notion of sympathy. Each substance in its manifestation of the divine essence is in perfect harmony, in perfect coordination with each other, pretty much like the keys of the piano.